So first, thank you very much, David, and the Center for hosting this important talk. I think we are, as you mentioned, at a key moment for sport and human rights. And it's really a pleasure to be here and join Natsuko on this event. So my name is Andrea Florence. I'm the director of the Sport and Rights Alliance. I'm a human rights lawyer, movement builder, and passionate for hope-based campaigns. The Sport and Rights Alliance is a global coalition of civil society and trade union organizations working to embed human rights in the world of sports. We exist to really voice and to allow for space for people that are directly impacted or that are potentially impacted by sports, be it in sports or around sports. We have organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, World Players Association, but also trade unions like the Player Associations and the International Trade Union Confederation, and survivor organizations like the Army of Survivors. We are really here to support people that have been impacted by sports and to really try to advance systemic and policy change within sports governing bodies so that those negative impacts don't happen anymore.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. Natsuko, would you like to just introduce yourself and the context within which you're interested in this topic area?
Okay, thank you for having me. And I'm Natsuko Sasaki from Paris, but as you can see with my face and you can hear with my accent, I'm a Japanese woman. And but I am the oldest member of an anti-Olympic group called Summarises 2024 in Paris. And you may wonder why a Japanese woman represents a group in Paris, but it is no surprise actually if you know the history of anti-Olympic struggle in last 2 decades, and especially since Rio 2016, we noticed that the bilingual or bicultural or polyglot people are often the core of an anti-Olympic group. And I'm very sorry that Adam Talbot is not with us today. And he is one good example. He was in Rio de Janeiro, but he's a English guy or Scottish guy, maybe English guy
yes,
in
English.
Scotland. And those people like Adam is often in a very important position to lead anti-Olympic struggle. He is bilingual with Portuguese and English. And this is also my case. I don't speak Portuguese, but I learned what happened in Japan for 2020 and 21 Tokyo Games, and I learned many things with the Tokyo Games. And with this knowledge as a native speaker of Japanese language, I had so many things to bring to Paris context. So that's one reason, yes, someone like me played somewhat important role in struggles in Paris. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Natsuko. Yes, the kind of transnational dimension of this movement and issues around about Olympics is going to be fascinating to hear more about in the next 40 minutes or so. So thanks for the introductions. We're now just going to, the format we're going to use for this is to try and make a sort of discussion of 3 key prompts. So we have 3 questions that we're going to ask Andrea and Natsuko to address in 5 minutes each, just to kind of deal with each of those issues separately, and then we'll bring it together in discussion at the end. So the first question, which we're going to pose to Andrea first, is could you just outline for us from your perspective what the current problems with mega events like the Olympic Games are from a human rights perspective?
Thanks, David. So first, to give an overview, I think mega sporting events are really seen by the broad audience as a model of unity and human achievement, right? With audiences that are growingly invested in the principles of equality and freedom and justice. And those are essentially human rights principles, right, that are translated concretely in sports and in sports events. In an increasingly polarized world, we also see sports as an important leverage point to break echo chambers of human rights and to really try to bridge the cultural, geographical, and political divide. So billions of people watch, read, and care about sports. But also, as your question highlights, sports mirrors the challenges that we face in society. So breaking sports' fundamental rules, we see child athletes, fans, women discriminated against. We see injustices against LGBTI people and people that are excluded and discriminated against. But also outside of sports, we see communities being forcibly removed from their homes without fair compensation. We see events taking place merely to sports wash, right, to cover under the carpet, under the rug, violations that occur on a daily basis. And so we really see how sports has this potential to advance human rights, but it needs to truly embed human rights in its entirety, so in its governance, in its implementation. And that I see as your second point, to be able to be this force for good. Right now, we see sports that are living as a legacy of far right-wing governments like they did in Brazil because of the legislations that passed that are very conservative, very very militarized in terms of security forces that increase the criminalization of protest rights, that limit press freedom and freedom of expression, and that also violates digital security and personal rights, and that leave that legacy behind, right? So at the Sport and Rights Alliance, we believe sports can be a force for good, but it truly needs to embed human rights, not only in the way it's implementing the event, but also how it sees its impact and how its risk assessment is conducted. But that I leave for the second question.
Thank you very much. So lots of issues in there. I'm sure some of these will also be related to Natsuko's experience on the ground in Paris and beyond. Natsuko, would you like to also address that first question, which is in terms of what are the problems with mega events, especially with the context of the Olympic Games?
Thank you very much. We anti-Olympic group in Paris called the Saccage 2024. We mainly argued there are 4 big problems with the Olympics. And first one is the economic problem. It's always the organizers and other stakeholders who make money, but the local business do not really take advantage of the mega event. And the second one is ecological and environmental problem. And there is a very nice Nature article which became a reference. I will send you the link of this piece. Maybe most serious scholars know this piece. And the third one is democratic problem. And maybe we can call this democratic problem as a human rights problem as well. In the case of Paris, French government adopted the artificial intelligence enhanced the video surveillance system for the first time in European Union country. And the fourth problem is a social problem, mainly gentrification and forced move for people who had lived in the site of mainly the Olympic Village. But those 4 problems are, from my point of view, just symptoms. And of course, those 4 problems which happen in host city after host city are extremely important. And that's the reason why people some people are against the games and some people criticize the games. But after having passed 8 years as an anti-Olympic activist, I am personally no longer interested in talk about the symptoms, but the cause. What is the cause of for symptoms like this? There are many arguments possible, but I just in 5 minutes, I just tell you one principal cause. The Olympic Games or the FIFA World Cup, those two emblematic sporting mega events, are organized by a private institution, non-profit organization called the International Olympic Committee and FIFA. And those institutions are not public organizations, but private one, and they don't even pay tax because they are, legally speaking, they are, NGO, I think. But anyway, no profit. But to organize their events, they absolutely depend on taxpayers' money in host city after host city. And the problem is they change the country for each edition. So most taxpayers in host country or host cities are not well prepared to argue the nature of these private events, to mobilize your tax money, your public money. And yes, and I will keep my answer to the solution for next talk. But the basic problem is they need our money for their event. That is the fundamental problem. That's all.
Thank you, Natsuko. Yeah, again, related to the kind of points you've drawn attention to, a series of issues there around about the kind of 4 dimensions that you identified, and very clear on the kind of reasons you think that create the kind of cause for how we get to that position. So in the context of the sort of second area that we want you to sort of outline your thoughts on, that's really about how should mega events change? How should the Olympics and FIFA World Cup in particular change to have less impact on human rights? So what sort of solutions do you have in mind or are working on from your perspectives that can help mega events change for the better, no doubt? Andrea, I would like to go first again, please.
Thank you, David. And yeah, Natsuko pointed to some really important aspects, including, the economic and the governance of sports that need to be completely reviewed when it comes to human rights. So I think as an overarching point in my reply to your question, I really want to emphasize the governance part that needs to be completely reviewed, reevaluated, both in terms of the economic side, but also in terms of representation, right? When we see the way and who are the people represented in boards and in high governance spaces within sports governing bodies. First of all, they don't represent the world, sort of to say, so they represent a very limited view of society that is mainly North global white male, and they also don't have the right systems in place to do the checks and balances required by human rights. So for instance, we are going to see now very soon the election of the new IOC president. And in our view, this is a key moment to ensure that human rights are embedded throughout the Olympic movement by having human rights criteria and scrutinizing the candidates around their understanding of human rights or their commitments to human rights. What are their plans to ensure that the International Olympic Committee adheres to human rights and upholds human rights when they're selecting new hosts for the Olympics? So that's an overarching point. And then more concretely, I would like to highlight 4 points. from the bidding process to the implementation part, I would say in the bidding criteria, it's super important to have human rights as a criteria to be selected, and that this is done really in a thorough way. So it relates to the second point, that is the human rights risk assessment evaluation. So as an example, I would point to the Saudi Arabia Men's World Cup and how FIFA has conducted this process that the Sport and Rights Alliance, together with Amnesty International, we've produced 2 reports. One looking at the human rights risk connected to both the 2030 and 2034 World Cups, but also how the human rights strategies for the 2030 and 2034 World Cup were dangerously flawed, and how actually FIFA needs to halt the selection of Saudi Arabia because of the immense risks that are posed. So until they do major human rights reforms before the selection, then we think the entire process should be put on hold. And I will link on the chat the reports that we have produced. So the third point, which I wanted to highlight, so the first one was the bidding criteria, the second one is the risk assessment, and then the relation with Saudi Arabia. And the third one is the monitoring system. So that is having a grievance mechanism that is well communicated in advance, that is transparent, and that has an independent set of people analyzing all the grievances that are coming in. The grievance mechanism needs to be put in place at the very moment where the country or the city is selected to host a mega sporting event. And that's because as soon as the country or city is announced, the impacts are already in place, right? There are hotels being built because of that. There are stadiums, or there are roads. So the entire system in a country or in a city changes as soon as there is an event like the World Cup or the Olympics announced. So it's super important that if the International Olympic Committee or FIFA are really committed to upholding human rights, that they have a place where people and communities can file grievances related to the event. And then the fourth point that I want to highlight is remedy. So not only that we have a system to put our grievances, but that behind the system, there is a remedy in place. So be it an apology or, a way to provide support, but also to really give a remedy back to the victim. So that is, again, I want to highlight the call we had related to the Qatar World Cup, and that FIFA pays the families that had their family members killed while building the stadiums in Qatar. And FIFA had promised to provide compensation to those families, but this report was simply buried somewhere and we cannot access. So the FIFA's Human Rights Subcommittee has conducted a report on how FIFA should pay for the migrant workers' families, but somehow when it comes to the top, then it's simply not followed through or not continued. And we really think we need to push for it, not only because of Qatar, of course, but also because it's an important jurisprudence and practice for future events. When thinking about, again, hosting in a country that has no protection for workers, where labor unions are restricted, it's really important that the event organizer has already, since the awarding, a provision for remedy in case of major human rights violations. And my final point is just to highlight the responsibility also of governments and sponsors. So Switzerland, as the main host for major sports governing bodies like the IOC, FIFA, but also UEFA, FIBA, I mean, FINA, all of the main sports federations are based in Switzerland. So Switzerland also has a responsibility to ensure that the organizations based in its country are not respecting human rights when they produce big sporting events in other countries in the world. So I would really emphasize Switzerland's role there. And then finally, the sponsors. When they are sponsoring events that are connected to massive human rights violations, they are also responsible for it. So on the one hand, I see the model that Natsuko was highlighting as, very difficult, but it also, we can highlight everyone's responsibility. So it's, of course, the sports governing body's responsibility, but it's also the government that is hosting. It's also the government that is bidding, and it's also the sponsors' responsibility. So if we all stop playing hot potato with these topics and really embrace human rights, we could have a very powerful and very long-lasting human rights change through sports. We just really need everyone to step up and to ensure that their own human rights responsibilities are in check and that are respected throughout the bidding process until the legacy.
That's great, Andrea. Really thorough set of recommendations and solutions. It really struck me that the idea of responsibility in terms of taking responsibility, but and being clear who has responsibilities that they need to follow through on there, and also that importance of kind of leveraging early in terms of the ability to build in, say, human rights considerations from the very earliest stage, because that's when these agendas are set in place. So I'll hand over again to you, Natsuko. What needs to change in respect of solutions, let's say, to some of the challenges that you identified in your first response?
Yeah, as an anti-Olympic activist, I absolutely don't care if the FIFA and the IOC disappear tomorrow. I really don't care. And many people, many comrades around the future first stage agree with me. But if I say, okay, let's make the IOC and the FIFA disappear, it is the end of conversation. And I discovered that this position don't produce a very interesting conversation during my 8 years of activism. So I published, it is a at about the moment, I published this book in July 2024, so just before the games in Paris, and it is written in Japanese language. And I conclude my book by introducing the 3 reform plans presented by Nation Peace, the link of which I sent the link, and they propose downsides and rotation of host cities and the governance reform. And I totally agree with the downsides proposal, which mean excluding all professional games like football, basketball, and maybe golf. Why the golf is still in the Olympics, seriously? And so that kind of the games or international federation, which actually don't need the money from the IOC, maybe we can exclude from the Olympic Games. And I am not the first person to propose this idea, and it is completely doable, and it's very hard to argue against this proposal. Why do you need the football in the Olympic Games? Seriously, there is no concrete answer. And yes, and the model of downsizing, actually, we can find in the history of the Olympics in England. the games in London, not 2012, but 1948, of course. And this games was not, it was profitable, and we can go back to the London 1948. That is one proposal. And I'm very glad that Andrea talked about the responsibility of Switzerland. I totally agree. Switzerland is a part of the problem. And not only this country is a part of the problem, but also the founder of the International Olympic Committee, Pierre de Coubertin, proposed in the beginning of 20th century to have permanent Olympic site near Lemon Lake. And why don't we have permanent Olympic state in Switzerland? Why not in Lausanne? And Lausanne can host Winter Games and Summer Games, 2 games. And I concluded my books with this proposition. Let Lausanne host forever every Olympic Games. That's all.
Thank you. So we have the answer. We have the answer to the problem. We can end the discussion there. No, obviously there's some really interesting around about that reduction in size and scale, and there's clearly been a lot of critique of gigantism in this Olympics and other mega events. There seem to be sort of some attempts to reduce that with reform, but not fundamental, I think, just around the edges reduction. So I think no doubt people might have some questions around about that. I'm going to go on just to this is going really well in terms of your timings. The last kind of area question was, and it relates to, I think, to both of you have discussed issues around about kind of democracy and the role of different actors within the space around about megasport events and being represented. And that question to Andrea first is, what's the role of civil society in creating change in this mega event space?
Yeah, no, thanks, David. So it is just essential. Like, I can't find another word for crucial, essential, key. The event is ours, right? So, like, the event wouldn't happen without the athletes. The event wouldn't happen without the supporters and the fans. And the event wouldn't happen without the countries that host those events. So we need to really take back the event itself. The athletes, the fans, the spectators, the communities. And by that, we need to be not only consulted, but engaged throughout the process. And I think that's a key difference when it comes to meaningful engagement criteria from the UN Guiding Principles requirements. So Rachel Davis Rachel Davis is one of the authors of the UN Guiding Principles, and together with John Ruggie, of course. But once Rachel Davis, in a meeting with us, she highlighted the difference between meaningful stakeholder engagement and how this is actually a way to analyze the seriousness of the sports governing bodies or of the business company in its implementation of the UN Guiding Principles. So what is their level of seriousness in terms of implementing their human rights obligations? So it goes from not talking at all with civil society organizations to informing civil society organizations to consulting, but then not telling them what they did with this consultation, to the final and most wanted way, or like the required way, which is really to engage in a discussion that is both ways, right? That it is co-creating the solutions, right? It is talking to people that are impacted or that were impacted to see what went wrong and what could have been done better, right? Is having brave and honest conversations that involves apologies and that involves mistakes, right? I think that is also an important point that I feel sports governing bodies, maybe because of the sports culture of the winner-loser situation, rarely want to acknowledge mistakes, right? And embracing human rights and actually respecting human rights means acknowledging mistakes. It means acknowledging mistakes to be able to move forward in a way that is more respecting. So you can't build a prevention system without acknowledging what happened and without really understanding the mistakes that happened. So I take the example of child rights there. So sports governing bodies, all of them, do a lot of programs on safeguarding. But what we ask at the Sport and Rights Alliance is, what have you done to look into what survivors of abuse have said in the past? What have you done to apologize to them? What have you done to listen to them? So what is those systems that you're creating to prevent child abuse? What are they going to do if you don't even know what happened in the past? So to be able to look at the future in a responsible way, in a way that is not just window dressing, you really have to look to the past. And you have to talk to survivors. You have to talk to those people that were impacted by harassment and abuse to be able to create programs that will prevent that from happening. And so the role of civil society is crucial, again, when looking at prevention systems. And then when it comes to mega sporting events throughout the event. And finally, my last point is just to highlight how UEFA in this sense has innovated, because we saw both from the very beginning in 2017, when we were able to negotiate human rights criteria to be part of the bidding process. So when Germany was selected to host the Man Zero in 2024, they had this obligation, right? So from the start, they had human rights requirements as part of their implementation. And so then it triggered a process that they had to engage with civil society organizations, but they did that in a way that I thought it was innovative, because and it was a leap of faith on our end as well, like from civil society organizations, to be part of a board, a human rights board for the event. And then in my view, there are many things that could have been happened differently. The board could have been set up from very beginning. The grievance mechanism should have been in place, as I mentioned before, from the start of the selection process. But there was a way during the games that civil society organizations could directly make recommendations for the event to change on site, right? And those recommendations were made at the very top of the organization. And then it was the closest we got to really engagement, as Rachel Davis said in the beginning. We had our positions, they would reply to everything that we were proposing, they would change some things that they could change, but there was a conversation happening. There are many things, as I said, that could have been done differently, that we are pushing for to happen differently, but there was at least a goodwill to see their mistakes, right? To see what could have been done better. So just wanted to highlight that as one example of how civil society has had a role changing mega sporting events and trying to make it more human rights responsible.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that agenda around about kind of engagement, consultation, nature of participation, etc., is fascinating. And again, that I always think about the kind of different degrees of participation and meaningful engagement in that process. And often, I think it is often a little bit too tokenistic, and we can discuss perhaps towards the end why that is, in terms of why the organizations are unable to go deeper with that approach. Natsuko, would you like to just again please address that final question, which is about the kind of role of civil society in the process of change that you would like to see happen?
My short answer is it's extremely difficult. actually civil society actually had no power to change the games. And some people say Paris Games was a success. Actually, many people say Paris Games was a success. And this Rio de Janeiro and Tokyo didn't enjoy this status, but Paris Games changed the course. This is what people want to say and people are actually saying. But Paris Games were not perfect games either in France. The coalition called the Rivers of Medal, Le Brevet de la Médaille, led by a big non-profit organization called Médecins du Monde, the world's medicine, made a report which said that there were many human rights violations during and especially before the games in Paris. But yes, so the games in Paris were not perfect at all if you look closely. And that is a proof that the civil society can actually do very little things when the games come to your country and we are powerless. And to prevent that, the best solution is not having the games at all in your country. And from my point of view, no country or no city don't deserve to conclude a host city contract with the International Olympic Committee. This host city contract is a pure scandal. Why any mayor can sign this contract, I still don't understand, but it keeps going on. And yes, and again, the best solution of not having the problem at all in your host city is not signing the host city contract. So your mobilization during the bid phase is absolutely crucial, and many anti-bid groups actually succeeded. If people get mobilized before the attribution of a host city, you often succeed. But once your mayor decided to have the games, you lose. There is no solution actually. No, you lose. That's the point. So for me, the real question is how to mobilize against the bid. This is I personally failed. I already said that I've been anti-Olympic activist since 8 years, and 8 years before was 2017, and this is the year that Paris got the game. So the beginning of my activism was anti-bid, and it failed in France. But this is not the case in other parts of the world. And for me to make meaningful reforms, say downsizing of the games or having a permanent host city of the World Cups or Olympic Games, that's from my point of view, those are only meaningful reforms of the games. It's possible only with only when anti-games discourse have power in dominant power in this battle, and how to reach this how to win this the battle of discourse. Actually it's difficult for civil society, which often discovers when the games arrive in your country. So the only people who are interested in the games before the mayor decided to have the games in your country are actually scholars and some journalists, but mainly our anti-Olympic struggles heavily dependent on the works by scholars like Adam Talbot, but actually the emergence of Jules Boykoff in Pacific University changed a lot. And he produced his works in English And of course, English is the most useful language to disseminate your idea and arguments. And the next host cities, Los Angeles and Brisbane and Salt Lake City of 2034 Winter Games take place in English-speaking world, and there are many good anti-Olympic literature in this language, and I think it can be interesting the following decade. There is a good accumulation of conversation, and the activists easily rely on those scholarly knowledge, and we didn't succeed in France because we didn't succeed to translate any work of Jules Boykoff actually, and the conversation didn't take place. But maybe this will be changed in following years. That's what I hope. And today, 40 participants are actually English speakers, so that we make this event in this language, and we all can contribute this conversation. And producing a critical discourse in English language is critical, especially in the context that India is interested in hosting the games in future, and Indian journalists can fluently read this language. So yes, let's keep on conversing together. Thank you.
Thank you, Natsuko. Okay, so that was really interesting insights from both of you around about those three prompts. We've got about 15 minutes left to now kind of hear a little bit from the audience about any questions that they have based on what you've said. And there's one in there at the moment from Catherine around about the kind of transnationalism around about kind of movements against the Olympics or to change the Olympics. And I think what's quite striking about both of your responses earlier is that obviously, Natsuko, you're suggesting we should, anti-Olympic movements, especially at that early stage, can be the most successful because you can leverage those. That's where you have most power. Andrea, you talked quite a lot about how you can, from within and within that kind of structures where you're having the opportunities to interact with the bodies, you can seek to ensure change right from the earliest stage so that at least you're not having these events being infringing, because you can actually make something happen at that point. So I'd like you both maybe just to reflect on, and maybe come to you first, Andrea, just because of the order we've been going on, is how you can lobby and activate for change. How does that work in the nature of your organization, for example, in terms of how you can have those conversations and go beyond just the dialogue into seeing something concrete in the actions of the awarding bodies?
Yeah, thank you, David. And that's an interesting and important question. I think the Sport and Rights Alliance has a unique position there because of not only the athletes, so the World Players Association representing athletes that are unionized and that have a standing, really. So they have bargaining agreements with different sports governing bodies where they can include human rights obligations in it. But they also, so they have a legal standing, right? Then we have the Football Supporters Europe, so the supporters group, and they also have an important standing as the groups of people that are actually making the sport happen from the other side, right? They are the ones that are contributing to the event, and so they also have an important standing. And then the third important group is the civil society organizations, so people that are organizations that are on the ground reporting everything that is happening to the local communities in different ways, that are advocating and making those recommendations in terms of policy as well, based on what they're seeing on the ground. So that's Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, ILGA World, so the International Lesbian and Gay Association. the Committee to Protect Journalists, looking at press freedom. That is also super important. And then you have the groups that are representing the unionized workers, right? That are crucial. That's part of supply chain contracts that you can see changes right from the start. So for instance, when you look at the 2026 Men's World Cup and the contracts that are being signed or that have already been signed, they were negotiated also, or they should have, some were, but they all should have been negotiated with unions, right? To make sure that they respected supply chain legislation and human rights, and that they were conducted in the best application of the ILO conventions and so on. So I think all this to say, I think we advance, or the way we try to push for changes by highlighting the representation, so the legal standing, but also the weight of the organizations, and how serious they are when they are analyzing the human rights violations, when they are proposing policy or remedy recommendations. And then finally, when the weight of the representation doesn't work, we campaign, right? We really raise our voice. We are not shy to call out injustices and to be really a watchdog for the stakeholders and the people and the communities that we represent. So be it from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, like being together with Vila Autódromo, standing with the local communities that were being forcibly removed, and being able to action the International Olympic Committee to say, look, they're going to be forcibly removed. You need to contact the Brazilian government right away for this not to happen, like intervening in a way that should have been there systematically, right? It shouldn't be based on organizational ins or outs, right? Everyone should be able to have a mechanism where they can action when such a big violation is about to happen, right? But the way we are trying to deal with the system as it stands is to try to avoid the impact right away, but also to use that as a leverage to try to advance systemic changes, right? It shouldn't be that way. We continue to use the knowledge we have from different events forward. So I think this global perspective is super important. Divide and conquer is a strategy, right? I think part of the way to deal with those events going from place to place is also like people forget, and then you can do the same things over again and violate everyone's rights again in a different country, right? So having an alliance, that's why for us it's super important to exist, right, at the global level. So we try to take the learnings and keep pushing at the international level from event to event, so that we don't forget. We show them that we don't forget, and we show them that we know what the impacts are. So our report on Saudi Arabia is really to say, you cannot say you didn't know, right? We are going on the record on what is a huge preventable crisis that we're trying to avoid. And in the future, you cannot say you did not know. So we are here to try to promote solutions, but also to highlight our voices and to really be a watchdog organization when violations occur.
Thank you, Andrea. In Natsuko, in terms of the transnational anti-Olympic movement and the kind of potential power of that, would you like to share some insights into how that's operating and what you feel that can actually achieve in terms of that continuity from one host to the next? Because that's always been a challenge, hasn't it? As Andrea talked about, in terms of the forgetting of what happened and the kind of the concerns from one host to the next.
Yes, actually, I am a part of this transnational anti-Olympic movement, and it is a big debate if we can call it a movement. And from my point of view, actually, no, we are just a handful of people who are accumulating the maybe interesting conversation, but we can't call it a political movement. So I was quite surprised to read in our chat box from Katrina Berger, a French name maybe. She concludes her first post with, nowadays, protest groups have become a real threat for the IOC and its income from Olympic Games. From the end of quote. This is the first time that someone told me, so I really want to ask Katarina, is it just your opinion or many people are actually saying this? Katarina, can you step in if possible?
I think she's replying in the chat. I think. We can't hear quite clearly, Catherine. So maybe if you can respond in the chat, that would be great. I'm just going to move us on to maybe the last. Maybe I'm aware we have 5 minutes left on the call. An interesting question from Jack Shepherd, who asks from Sweden, curious about whether there are arguments for countries with poor human rights records to host an Olympics, and how do we distinguish one country as worthy of hosting and another as not? Which is, I guess, again, very topical with the context, not just of the Olympics, but I guess of the World Cup at this point. Maybe, Andrea, just in a couple of minutes, are you able to kind of give a sense as to, from your perspective, how that decision around about the importance of human rights in the overall decision to award an event, it can be judged and can be differentiated?
Thank you. And that's we take a human rights approach. So we take a really human rights-based approach to everything that we do as an alliance and as our partners do. So we don't rule out any country to host. We think, and we also take as a baseline that every country has human rights that they need to improve, right? So it's not about being worthy or not, but it's about how much are you going to commit in terms of the basic human rights obligations that you have to be able to host such an event, right? Saudi Arabia was a big challenge to be able to analyze in that way and to say that no, it should not go for a vote. It's not even ready to be up for a vote. But we're not saying they can't be ready ever. If Saudi Arabia will announce major reforms, if it does really thorough engagement with civil society organizations, and it commits to doing that, we can't say that they are not eligible to host. But what we are saying is that in the current human rights analysis and risk assessment, they do not fulfill this criteria. So I think that's as far as we can go in terms of human rights-based organizations, is to say, well, when human rights criteria are not met, then the event should not be awarded.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Natsuko, you've obviously articulated a position around about the best solution is not to have an Olympics. In the context of Jack's question about that, any distinguishing ability to distinguish between those that should and shouldn't have, do you have a view just to bring the session to a close?
Yeah, but I'm not very, I don't feel I'm entitled to answer this question because my position is not hosting the games is the best solution. So I'm rather, but my question is, why do you think the IOC and the FIFA can be compatible with human rights values? Because those institutions are frankly they are not composed of respectable people from a human rights activist point of view. There are so many condemned people in the history of the IOC and FIFA, and for me, it makes sense that a country like Saudi Arabia hosts the World Cups rather than the very, I don't know, rather than Sweden, for example. I think by saying that Sweden is a human rightly speaking ideal country, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know nothing about Sweden. But anyway, for me, it doesn't really make sense to expect that the IOC and the FIFA are interested in important values like human rights, because those people are corrupted in most basic sense of the word, and I do not trust corrupt people. So I do not understand why Andrea has such a very high expectancy for someone like Thomas Bach, for example. He was the closest friend of uh, the president of Adidas, Horst Dassler. And if you know who Horst Dassler is, it doesn't really make sense to expect high value from this guy.
I'm sure we could continue on with that particular dialogue and debate for another hour. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring the session to a close just because we try and do these as 1 hour lunchtime-ish sessions. The dialogue will continue, and I think it will continue in many forms, academically, working with advocacy organisations and the like in this space. And it's certainly something that here at Centre for Culture, Sport and Events, we're very interested in contributing to and continue to make a contribution to. So I want to thank our speakers today, Andrea and Natsuko, for your engagement with the topic area and for your honesty and views expressed, and for sharing also some of the work that you've been participating in and have been progressing on in this area. So thank you to you both, and thanks to everyone who's joined today. As I said, this will be available as a recording on the CCSE YouTube channel, and we'll promote that out there afterwards. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.